to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, thanks for joining us today. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here with Bill Schofield, John Harrigan. Hey guys, how's it going?
What's up? Doing well.
Good, man.
Hey, good to see you guys. Good to be with you guys again today. Listeners, thanks for joining us. We are again excited about our third season, looking at the Tanakh. We spent a few episodes looking a little bit of an intro, and today we really want to get into this. But our first episode of this season, we spent some time just talking about what the Tanakh is, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, the Hebrew Bible, or the way that the Jews understood just simply the scriptures. And we started to develop a few of the major themes of the Tanakh. And today we actually want to get into one of these very first big themes. But before then, let's just talk quickly about some of our past episodes.
Yes. So second episode, we talked, we mentioned R. Kendall Solin's book a lot, but specifically for a particular framework that he developed that we thought was really helpful. That basically explained how the standard, what he called the standard canonical narrative or the standard Christian narrative for reading the Bible is that the passages that are relevant to the gospel story end up being creation, fall, and redemption, and then the final restoration of creation or whatever. So, but the problem with that is that means the only thing that's relevant to the gospel is Genesis 1 through 3, and then you jump up to Matthew through Revelation. So this is obviously problematic. So we wanted to just highlight, some of the reason for the need for a season like a Tanakh season.
Yeah, and then we had a third episode. We brought in Matthew Thiessen and just kind of talked through the history of Christian anti-Judaism that developed out of that narrative, kind of that non-Jewish narrative developed a history of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism within Christian theology, which really influences a lot of our kind of approach and how we look at the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. And so with that said, today we actually want to begin in the book of Genesis, and specifically just Genesis 1:1 in the creation of the heavens and the earth. And before we get into this, I think it would be important to mention this again, that some of our goals for this season and these teaching episodes in particular is not just to give you some conceptual information about the Tanakh, but really to help you connect the themes and the ideas from the Tanakh with the way that Jews in the Second Temple period and at the time of Jesus and how the apostles later thought and heard about them. So more than just presenting facts and presenting information, we want to help you connect this to how these ideas from the Tanakh undergird the apocalyptic hermeneutic and what led them to live the way that they did.
Right, because there's no getting around the fact that Ezekiel and Deuteronomy are sometimes saying different things.
Totally.
Or seemingly different things. And so ideas developed as history becomes complicated. And so the point of it, like Josh is saying, is as those developments and reframing of things happen, they're not contradictions. They're just basically looking at things a little bit differently. And so, but you really have to read Jesus and the apostles through that lens of how things had actually come to be thought about at their time, because that's the language they're talking about. And so the point of this is not, like Josh is saying, not just a Bible lesson. It's to actually understand how these things end up developing and the patterns of thought are being used in the first century.
Right. And we're going to reference, Jewish apocalyptic literature to anchor that this is actually how Jews are reading at the time, that it's not just us talking theoretically about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. This is actually the hermeneutic Jews are using at the time that are being assumed, which is being assumed in the New Testament.
Right.
And so
It's not just, this is what I think it means.
Right.
It's like, this is how Jesus and the apostles understood it to mean.
Right.
With more than just the New Testament, because if all we have is the New Testament, then we're stuck in that hermeneutical circle that these phrases say what they mean because they're used in the New Testament, but they're not defined. So they mean this because
totally
it's
circular,
what we
right.
have deduced inductively from the New Testament. And it's just a circle. It's a logical circle that can't go anywhere. So
Exactly. So yeah, I think listeners, this is really important to keep in mind, and why we're going to be referencing Second Temple literature often and frequently through this season on the Tanakh. So with that said, let's get into it. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, this is, I think, a really important place that we have to start in looking at the Tanakh. And not only is this laying out, I think perhaps you could say maybe the field of the game of the Bible, if you could relate the Bible to a game, right? And say, okay, well, this is the field that the game is played on, right? There's players, there's rules, but there's a field where this is played out. And this is not just conceptual. And so I think it would be helpful just for a minute or two here to talk about the history of interpretation related to the heavens and the earth. And I think, like we've done in past episodes, what are we not saying the heavens and the earth are? Well, I think I can start with this. One of the things we've talked about before, back in our episodes, one of our episodes in season 1, we talked about the heavens and the earth as, some may look at it and perceive it as just God's space and man's space. And, as if there's this overlapping concentric circles that indicate God and heaven and earth are just kind of mixing, and there's some intermingling of the realms. That's not necessarily helpful, because that implies what I think we've talked about a little bit before, but the idea of Platonic dualism and the immaterial versus the material realms. And that, of course, is something that is just highly based in Greek philosophy, where, you could trace the history all the way back through Plato and Aristotle, and then the dissemination of all of those ideas through Alexander the Great, and the conquering of the known world, and the dissemination of Greek philosophy throughout the known world, where this came to highly influence the way that the average Westerner understands the heavens and the earth. So what we're not saying, and what we're not going to try to communicate here, is the heavens and the earth are really just the supernatural versus the natural, or the immaterial versus the material. This is not the way that Second Temple Jews or the apostles were thinking about the idea of Genesis 1:1 and the heavens and the earth altogether. I think something else we have to bring into the conversation is, what about modern ideas, like debates that we have in modernity about, well, Genesis is talking about a flat earth or young earth versus old earth. Like, how do we look at Genesis and relate to these ideas that are often conversations about Genesis today?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not unlike the New Testament. Is basically it takes a lot of discipline to read the Bible as answering the questions that it's trying to answer.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to not, I end up talking to a lot of pastors and leaders, or not a lot, but a handful of them who, will be talking about issues, and the problem is when you want to go to Paul and his letters to address every single issue that's going on in your church. And it's really hard, but you're really just going to have to rely on God for wisdom, because there just isn't a text for everything you're facing right now,
right.
And so it's the same way there, where, somebody makes some sort of claim, whether it's flat earth or the age of the earth. And it's just not the way that they're just not claiming that. That's not what they're thinking. Now, we do know things like for sure, like they reference the age of the earth, not only in the Tanakh, but also in a lot of Second Temple literature. And there's no debate as to the age of the earth in Second Temple literature. It's always literal days. It's always a young earth. In fact, the theology of, which we'll talk about more next week, but the theology of kind of eschatology and kind of an apocalyptic conclusion in a lot of texts rely on a young earth reading, but that's another story. But like it's not trying to talk about the sphere versus a flat earth. I mean, and so when I first heard about the flat earth theory, I was like, well, there's all these theories under the sun, whatever. And then somebody's like, no, it's like all Christians. It's all Christians who are saying that this is what the Bible's teaching. It's like, oh, good Lord.
Our good friend Joel Richardson has a lot of good material discussing the issues of flat earth and all of that. So definitely go check Joel out on his Twitter and on his YouTube channel. He's got a lot of stuff about it.
Yeah. And along those lines, there's no doubt that Genesis it's not written as a scientific text for them. But they assumed it according to how they viewed history and the universe, and they're all young earth. So it was just presumed. So debates that are happening now about the age of the earth wasn't a debate they were having back then. But how they understood the history of the universe was young earth, period. There's no debate about it. It just was. And so that becomes an issue of, well, how do you want to take how they viewed things and deal with the modern context and controversy? That's a different animal. And we can, but it's definitely, it's kind of a little bit deceitful to say, well, it's not a scientific text. Therefore, it's okay to argue for an old earth. Well, that's a different animal.
It's totally different.
You can't project an old earth onto the Tanakh or Second Temple literature, because that's just not even remotely in anybody's mind back then. Now, if you want to say that that's an ancient worldview and it's irrelevant today, and now we have a more modern science, and you can make that argument. That's a different thing. You can make that argument, and we can argue that on its own theoretical grounds. But to project that onto the text itself, well, that's just ridiculous.
That does not work.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, I think it is good to begin just this little section of what we are not saying and what we're not trying to address here in our talk about Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But with that said, what are we saying? What do we want to highlight? And what does Second Temple literature, what does the rest of the Tanakh, what do Jesus and the apostles highlight, and what do they grab a hold of in terms of their writings and their sayings and how they live in light of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is, in fact, those of you who haven't read the Gospel of Christ Crucified, John's second chapter, I think it is, on creation, has a really good framework for helping to begin to understand. Because like Josh called it, the playing field. So you'd be surprised how much it changes your reading of the Bible and even of theology when you read God created the spiritual and the material. You'd be shocked if you've never worked through it. So the fact is, at the very beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and really both have form, both have shape and materiality. All throughout the scriptures, they have form and shape. And you have Isaiah 6, and his heavenly experience includes shaking. It includes posts that are shaking. It includes a train that's of a robe that's filling a sanctuary, and
a hot coal with tongs.
Right, that burns him. And so every single heavenly experience in the scriptures, New Testament and Old, always involves material descriptions. It's spatial, and furthermore, it's timely. Like there are time descriptors throughout all of these passages.
A fun verse I use is with my students here is Revelation 8:1, right?
Yeah.
John sees, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. And people go, what? Wait, I thought heaven was this timeless, static, immaterial realm.
But really, this is how we've developed, or tradition has basically been handed down to us to read it that way. And it's actually, and it's come with theology attached, because as soon as it gets challenged, you kind of feel like something holy is being touched. Mm-hmm. Like you're making God, God's home is too physical, as though inherently being immaterial is more holy. Hello, Plato.
Right.
Hello, Plato.
Yeah, I think kind of defining the structure of the universe as Jews understood it in their day is super critical to understanding how they viewed the relationship between God and humanity, the covenant with Israel, the future, how it's going to play out, and so one of the kind of classic texts, there's a number of places where the heavens are described outside of the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature, but probably Second Enoch is the most descriptive. So in Second Enoch, the seventh from Adam, supposedly is taken up into the heavens. And chapter 3, he's shown the first heaven, that angels took him up on their wings, placed him on the clouds. Behold, they were moving, and I perceived the air higher up, and higher still I saw the ether, and they placed me on the first heaven, and they showed me a vast ocean, bigger than the earthly ocean. Then he's taken up, and there he saw the angels, 200 angels who govern the stars, the heavenly combinations, the rulers of the stellar orders, angels that guard the storehouses of snow and wind and ice. And then he goes up to the second heaven, which is real negative. There's darkness and weeping there. And then he's taken up to the third heaven, where he saw paradise, a place inconceivably pleasant. I saw trees in full flower. Their fruits were ripe, pleasant smelling, and every food in yield, giving off profusely a pleasant fragrance. And in the midst of it, the tree of life, more beautiful than anything created. And then he's taken up, he's taken up in chapter 11 to the fourth heaven, and he sees the solar and the lunar tracks, kind of in accordance with creation. In the beginning, the heavens are the same way, where Eden was viewed as created on day 3, and then the sun and moon and stars on day 4, and so the heavens kind of mirror that a little bit. And then the solar tracks are you get that highlight in Second Temple text, because that defines the calendar, the Jewish calendar. So you get a lot of discussion on that. And then chapter 18, you get Enoch sees the fifth heaven. There I saw an innumerable armies, their appearance like the appearance of men, but their size larger than that of giants. And then chapter 19, he's taken to the sixth heaven. There I saw 7 groups of angels, brilliant and very glorious. Their faces were more radiant than the radiance of the sun. In the midst of them were 7 phoenixes and 7 cherubim and 7 6-winged beings, having one voice singing in unison. So you get kind of echoes of the book of Revelation there. So then in chapter 20, he's taken up to the 7th heaven. He saw an exceptionally great light and fiery armies of the great archangels, cherubim, authorities, seraphim, and many thrones. And that's kind of the front porch of the 10th heaven for Enoch. And then Enoch is taken up. And in the 7th heaven, you have all of these beings, and they're carrying on with day and night singing, "Holy, holy, holy. The heaven and earth are filled with his glory." So they're echoing Isaiah 6. Of course, that gets picked up in Revelation 2. And then chapter 22 is kind of the climax where he's taken up to the 10th heaven. He views the face of the Lord burning like an iron, burning hot with fire. And the face of the Lord is not to be talked about. It's so very marvelous and supremely awesome and supremely frightening. So anyway, this kind of fleshes out the dynamics that Jews presumed reading Genesis 1 and the heavens and the earth, that there's a plurality of heavens, that they're very physical, that they're continuous, that they don't, there's no stark kind of split in creation between material and immaterial, but rather they're dynamically related, and there's a plurality of them. And there's movement between them, going up and coming down, and that the God's governance is over a vast plurality of realms that are dynamically related, and that are in kind of a hierarchical form, which we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about divine sovereignty.
Yeah, and so to connect this back here with the Tanakh, so we can go from Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens. So what John just read, at some point, it's concrete enough to assume that this is what is being talked about. He created the heavens and the earth. The earth is easier for us to understand. But then again, you get to Genesis. You get to a Genesis 2:1, and it restates it and says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were created with all of their hosts." And you guys are probably familiar throughout the Tanakh with the language and the hosts of heaven. And sometimes in the prophets, they bow down and they worship the hosts of heaven. Or in Deuteronomy, you're not to worship the hosts of heaven. This is speaking of the innumerable company that was just envisioned there, and even the Lord of Hosts is a phrase that's used in the Tanakh, but it's used a lot in Second Temple Jewish literature, because it's basically emphasizing what is understood here. Again, when an ancient reader reads that he made the heavens and the earth, and it's not just that it's structured in tiers, it's that it's structured because who sits at the top, right? The Lord sits at the height of the heavens, or another phrase in the Psalms is he sits in the heaven of the heavens. So creation is really structured to communicate, and it's lost within the material and immaterial distinction. Again, it's artificial and it's overlaid because of, later Christian flirtation with Neoplatonism. But what's lost is the theology of basically that the universe is structured around God's sovereignty. And so this is really why the idea is being communicated in terms of to the original audience, is to reinforce the idea of his sovereignty.
Yeah, Bill. And I think it's important that this idea of sovereignty, when we say sovereignty, I think there's some baggage related to the word because of the Reformation and Calvinism in the modern mind of the reader, or the modern mind.
Good point.
Believers and Christians here in the West. But what we don't mean when we say divine sovereignty is some sort of predeterminism or some sort of Calvinistic idea. What we do mean is simply how the word sovereignty is understood etymologically. It is authority, rulership, and primarily we're saying, okay, if God is divine, if we're talking about divine sovereignty, we're talking about his rulership over his creation, which is the sum of the heavens and the earth, right? So
too many words have a Bible meaning and then a real meaning.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. Exactly. So yeah, I think you're exactly right, Bill. Where the Lord created the heavens and the earth and all their hosts, and the fact that he sits enthroned at the height of the heavens, the implication there in a real physical, tangible, continuous space, that he sits enthroned at the height, and that the idea of height and the euphemism of height is to represent and indicate that he is the ruler and the sovereign over the heavens and the earth.
And so even thinking about it in terms of the text and how the context for the text being even handed down, written and handed down. So post-Exodus, and however you date the final of it, regardless of how you date the final of it, there's tons of evidence that the Torah was written earlier, even if it had redactors and there were things that were added. This is fine. But there's too much evidence that there's too many references to things that only a really early audience in a certain geographical location would have understood that can't be explained by, if you're familiar with Wellhausen, documentary hypothesis, and things like that. It can't work. And that's been acknowledged, generally speaking, though, it still has ripple effects in the academy. But so the point is that the reason for retelling these things, because a lot of them were handed down orally and they were understood. But the reason for retelling them, if you think about the context of the group that had just left Egypt and the dramatic events in the Exodus, is the handing down of this story essentially frames and reinforces that their God, the God of their fathers, who's now becoming their God as of Sinai or Exodus 20, the encounter at Sinai, he is the God who's the creator of the heavens and earth, and thus the sovereign of the other gods. And so he's here communicated as the creator of the hosts of heaven, which by virtue of being the creator implies sovereign or having authority over. And then the tiered structure of the heavens is later emphasized simply to reinforce that the creator is the boss. The creator has authority.
That's good.
Yeah, I think a great example of how Jews viewed the book of Genesis is the book of Jubilees.
Yeah.
And in the Second Temple period. Now, whether the book of Jubilees is widely read or it's just a particular fascination of the Qumran community, no doubt they were really into it in Qumran. I'm not sure about the rest of broader Judaism, but it's a great example of, basically it says that Moses on Mount Sinai received this revelation. During the 40 days, he received the book of Jubilees. And the book of Jubilees basically just recounts from Genesis 1 through the Exodus. And it structures it specifically in Jubilee time frames, 7-year periods and cycles. And it's super focused on the Sabbath and the calendar and ritual purity. And so it starts out, it says, the angel of the presence spoke to Moses by the word of the Lord, saying, write the whole account of creation, that in 6 days the Lord God completed all his work and all that he created, and he observed a Sabbath on the 7th day, and he sanctified it for all ages, and he set it as a sign for all his works. For on the first day he created the heavens, which are above, and the earth, and the waters, and all the spirits which minister before him, the angels of the presence, the angels of sanctification, the angels of the spirit of fire, the angels of the spirit of the winds, the angels of the spirit of the clouds and darkness and snow and hail and frost, and the angels of resounding and the thunder and lightning, and the angels of the spirit of cold and heat and of winter and springtime and harvest and summer, and all the spirits of his creatures which are in the heaven and on the earth. And then he goes on to day 2 and day 3, etc. And so he really starts out, the book of Jubilees starts out with the heavens and the earth and framing those in a structure in which you have a multitude of beings that are ministers of the one sovereign, of the one Lord over the heavens and the earth. Right. And they administrate the heavens and the earth all the way from the height, all the way down to the earth, which then he creates, day 3, 4, 5, and 6, he creates everything and on the earth and his governance over that. But it really gives kind of a fleshing out of the structure of the universe, the playing field, and all the angelic beings that are involved. That then it goes on and talks about the rebellion that happens within that context and then how that plays out. But there's a lot more going on than just the material world and the immaterial world and, whatever happens in that context.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is such an important way to really start off a study of the Tanakh, because it's not just in Second Temple literature. It's really throughout the Tanakh that the heavens are more congested than rush hour in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
It is a busy, busy place in the heavens. And you find the same thing in the Tanakh, and it's spelled out in more detail. You have all the angels have names and stuff in Enoch, and the archangels have names, but really the gods are everywhere in the Tanakh.
Yep.
And if you don't understand why they're there, if you don't understand kind of how they understand where history is headed, and I think like the apostles actually highlight the gods of the nations several times in terms of where they understand history to be headed.
Yeah.
But if you don't understand that, then it's a challenge to read the narrative of the Tanakh, especially in light of Second Temple Jewish literature. But like the hosts of the heavens is a frequent term. Even the term Elohim, which is complicated because it's a plural, but it can function as a singular. It's an odd word in Hebrew, but sometimes it's hard to tell when the word God singular or the gods plural are being used. And the gods are simply I like how Mike Heiser explains that a lot of the attributes that we normally attach to the words G or the letters G-O-D are not native to the ancient world. Like someone being God didn't automatically assume that they were sovereign. Someone being God didn't automatically assume they were the creator, or that they had some sort of investment in the direction of humanity. None of these things are inherent in the word. The word really just implies some sort of a non-human being that is at least he's in some way he's above humans in terms of stature and authority structure. But which is why you have the frequent phrase, the God of Israel, because you have to explain which one you're talking about in the ancient world. And so the frequent use of the gods of the nations, like I just said, the gods of Israel, the hosts of heaven, these are all major players in the narrative. And if we don't get that down at the beginning, parts of what's going on are going to be hard to capture later on.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you made a really important point, Bill, and I'm connecting to something you said earlier and then something you mentioned as well, John, that it's so important that we see that there's more players in the story than just God and Adam, that God created a multitude of other, whether you call them Elohim, gods, divine beings, however they're referred to throughout Second Temple literature and the rest of the Tanakh, the host, right? That there's another player of the game in the story here. Yep. And this idea of divine sovereignty, the continuous nature of the heavens and putting the God of Israel above all the others is to imply, and not just imply, it is to put the definitive stamp on the fact that he rules over them all. And thus, because he created them, he rules over them. So you get a passage like, and we'll reference this maybe a little bit more later, but the passage I'm thinking of here is Psalm 82, pretty important passage in the Tanakh. Mike Heiser develops this pretty well, but the idea that God has a what some translations translate in Psalm 82 as a divine council, a group of these Elohim, of these hosts that he uses to help in the administration of the heavens and the earth. And there's a whole thing in Psalm 82 of how the accusation that God is making against these hosts of the heavens is that they did not function in the role that God had set them in. And so as a result, God is going to bring punishment and judgment upon them at the day of the Lord.
Right.
And, I think this is such a foreign thing to many people in the West. Again, just the larger idea of the host of the heavens or the gods or the Elohim or this hierarchy of divine beings that God created to help serve in the administration of his creation. But again, taking all of this, the fact that God has created them implies that he is the ruler over them all. Right. And again, this is the idea that is developed throughout the rest of the Tanakh and in Second Temple literature and assumed by Jesus and the apostles, that a dualistic kind of separate material and immaterial idea is not even close to what they were thinking about. And so, like you said, Bill, if we don't get this right at the beginning of our look at the Tanakh, we're going to miss so much of what the Tanakh and then the apostles and Jesus are trying to say. And that really, of course, has pastoral and discipleship implications for how we live, which, we're going to get into that at some point as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and you get it picked up in the apostolic witness where it's directly tied to Jesus, where he is, Colossians 1, he's preeminent over all the powers, authorities, principalities, etc. Or Ephesians 1, he's been set far above all rule, authority, power, dominion, etc. Every name to be named, not only in this age, but the age to come. And so having kind of flesh a little bit of context for the heavens and everything that's going on there from the beginning, administrating that divine governance, and then the rebellion and all the conflict that's happening, and then for Paul to talk about Jesus being enthroned above all of that in this age, that now Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, patiently waiting to make all of his enemies his footstool, and in the age to come, that as Messiah, when there's a new heavens and a new earth and wickedness is purged out of all of those, that he's going to have the same authority in the age to come. And it just gives a lot more meaning and kind of fleshes out that dynamic.
It is an odd reading that kind of sees kind of like what Paula Fredrickson calls modern monotheism into those passages, because it basically, both of those passages are just saying within that context that God made Jesus the sovereign and ruler over imaginary things that don't exist.
Right.
Modern monotheism.
Right.
Yeah, and one of the things, every time I read these phrases or passages like this in the New Testament, is, like I said, it's not just so that we understand the structure of the universe. It's the fact that, like we've said, what is implied by God's sovereignty is not just over whom he rules, it's how he's ordained history and where he's driving things.
Yeah.
And a great example that comes to mind in terms of how, like when Paul references these things, he knows well that, like, the language here is like from Isaiah 34 that comes to mind is all of the hosts of heaven will rot away, and the skies will roll up like a scroll, and all their hosts shall wither like a leaf withering on a vine, or a fruit withering on a fig tree. When my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens, lo, it will descend upon Edom, upon the people I have doomed to judgment. And so the idea is not just that these beings happen to exist, is that this is part of the redemption narrative.
Yeah.
Is that God is going to deal with these beings one day. And so even if Jesus is simply sitting in a place with God, waiting for the day of judgment is going to come.
Yeah.
Well, God's sword will be satisfied in the heavens from all these beings that he created that have since corrupted themselves. So again, this is a part of the narrative, not just a part of the structure.
Yeah, so an example of that in Jewish apocalyptic literature is like Testament of Levi, and which is 2nd century BC. Chapter 3, it says, "Listen therefore concerning the heavens which have been shown you by the angel to Levi. The lowest is dark for this reason. It sees all the injustices of humankind and contains fire, snow, and ice, ready for the day determined by God's righteous judgment. In it are all the spirits of those dispatched to achieve the punishment of mankind. In the second are the armies arrayed for the day of judgment, to work vengeance on the spirits of error and of Satan. Above them are the holy ones. The uppermost heaven of all dwells the great glory of the Holy of Holies, superior to all holiness. There with him are all the archangels who serve and offer sacrifices to the Lord in behalf of all the sins of ignorance of the righteous ones." And he goes on to describe those angels a little more. And then he says, "Know then that the Lord will effect judgment on the sons of men. For even when stones are split, the sun is extinguished, the water dried up, fire comes down, all creation is distraught. Therefore they shall be condemned and punished." And so the dynamic between creation, its structure, divine sovereignty, and where the Lord is pushing it toward the day of judgment to rectify everything, all of those are bound together in Jews' minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And this is a great example of this is what sometimes are called, these are sometimes called cosmic travel narratives. And we briefly, like in episode 1, I think, of season 1, we talked a little bit about how we're using the word apocalyptic. And the reason we had to do that is because the word apocalyptic literally has unlimited uses, because
it's a complete mess.
It's a disaster because it literally means nothing anymore. I guess a lot of language kind of does that at some point, but the beginning of the term actually comes from, like, the title of the book of Revelation in Greek is apocalypsis, and so the idea is it's from the beginning of Revelation, where it says the revelation or the apocalyptic of Jesus that was given to John. So the point is, it literally means the revelation or the revealing. And so they created a genre to study passages where a divine revelation of something otherworldly was given to someone. And generally it was characterized by these cosmic travel narratives. And so you find frequently in these what we call apocalyptic texts, you'll find cosmic travel narratives because they're being caught up in some way or caught somewhere to receive information about the future and what's really going on the earth and things like this. So cosmic travel narratives like this are actually fairly common. Testament of Levi's 1, you guys might be more familiar with Enoch. First Enoch has a smaller one, but Second Enoch has more elaborate. But the point is that they're always, number one, the cosmic travel narratives are always, again, the universe is tiered around God's sovereignty, but they're always attached to a message to encourage the reader that this is where the sovereign one is driving the world to. And obviously this is the Testament of Levi that John just read is no exception to that. First, Second Enoch are no exception. That it's not just that God's sovereign, it's communicating that God is sovereign, which everyone knew because of the tiering of the universe and that he created the hosts of heaven, but that he's for sure driving the world and the universe in a particular direction. And he does as he pleases because he's the sovereign. Yeah. And so a lot of these narratives kind of have that idea of God is sovereign and he's driving the world somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good, Bill. I think, one of the things that may come to your mind when you think about this, you go, okay, so Tanakh and Second Temple literature is talking about this tiered structure implying God's sovereignty. Well, what about the apostles? Well, you mentioned Colossians 1 and Ephesians 1, John. The other passage I would throw in here would be a classic one, 2 Corinthians 12, where the apostle Paul says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up into the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. Meaning, was this just a visionary experience or did he actually go there? Doesn't mean it's materiality or immateriality. He says, God knows, and I know this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Right? And so again, this is the apostle Paul, again, with this tiered structure of the heavens, saying paradise, even kind of referencing Enoch idea that we talked about earlier. And there we go. Paul himself, a Jew, is understanding the heavens in a tiered way, with the emphasis, as we've been saying, on God's sovereignty. Which, of course, he presumed that structure of the universe was moving towards 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and exactly. the judgment seat of the Messiah, when he's going to receive a heavenly dwelling, a resurrected body that's going to live forever. And because of all of that, the structure of the universe, the glory above that's going to be revealed at the day of the Messiah, therefore we seek to persuade men because we know the fear of the Lord, we know where history is headed, etc. And so all of that rests on how they read Genesis 1 through 3, how they understood the structure of the universe, how creation happened, how God, sits enthroned in all of that, how he rules over everything. All of that plays into how they view redemptive history and how it's moving in the future. Right. Which then, of course, affects how they live in light of that. If this is where history is going, how would they instruct people to live in light of God's sovereignty, in light of the tiered nature of the heavens? And if this is where God is driving history, how then shall we live, right? And so this really, I think, feeds into our next episode. We want to take Genesis 1 through 3 and highlight how this becomes a paradigm for redemption, really talk about how divine sovereignty relates to rebellion, whether it's rebellion of the powers in the heavens and rebellion of man, and how it relates to the redemption, how God intends to correct and judge and do away with, cleanse the earth and the heavens of that rebellion. And really, this is, again, how God's authority, how his sovereignty and rulership over the heavens and the earth is going to play out in the biblical narrative. Because, as you've said several times already this episode, Bill and John, that God is driving history. It's going somewhere. And again, this is what divine sovereignty means. It's not just purposeless, that God is kind of sitting in the heavens, twiddling his thumbs, going, okay, just worship me because I'm awesome. He has authority over his creation. He created everything, therefore he has authority over it, and he's driving history towards an ultimate end and an ultimate purpose. So this is what we want to begin to get into next week in our episode. So with that said, John and Bill, great to be with you guys today. Listeners, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you next time. God bless, and Maranatha. Maranatha. Maranatha.
Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.